The first thing I ever noticed about Virgil Berry was the sound of his absence. Ho! That might seem like a strange place to begin, noticing someone through what they leave behind rather than through their actual presence. But that is how it happened. And I have always believed that the truth of a thing deserves to be told exactly as it occurred, without smoothing over the inconvenient or the strange. I had moved into the Caldwell Arms 3 weeks before I noticed him at all. The building was one of those mid-century brick structures that had survived longer than anyone expected it to. All arched windows and cast-iron railings and radiators that sang through the night in winter like something metallic and dreaming. I had taken the apartment on the 3rd floor, number 3C, because the windows faced east and the rent was within my range, and because I had needed, desperately, to leave the place I had been before. The reasons for that leaving are their own story, and not the one I am telling now. What matters is that I was new there, still figuring out which pipes groaned before which others, still learning the particular language of that old building's body. My bedroom wall was shared with apartment 3B. For the first 3 weeks, I barely registered anything from that wall. A low murmur sometimes, the television perhaps, or music so contained it was almost more vibration than sound. Nothing unusual. Nothing that broke through the soft static of my own adjusting, my own learning to sleep in a new place with new shadows on the ceiling. And then, one morning, a Wednesday the 14th of October, because I remember looking at my phone when it woke me and thinking how much I resented the number 14 for no particular reason. I came awake at 4:53 in the morning to the sound of careful movement. It was the specific quality of the sound that made it interesting, not loud, not careless. It was the sound of someone trying very deliberately not to make noise, which paradoxically makes its own distinct pattern of sound. The soft compression of floorboards under weight, distributed deliberately. The whisper of a door closing with both hands, the latch eased back rather than clicked. Then footsteps in the corridor outside. Quiet, quick, gone. I lay in the dark and listened to the silence that followed and thought, someone in 3B leaves before 5 in the morning. I thought nothing more of it that day, filed it somewhere unremarkable and went back to sleep. But the next morning it happened again. 4:51. The same careful choreography of leaving, the measured steps, the controlled door, the corridor footsteps diminishing. And the morning after that. And the morning after that. Always somewhere between 4:45 and 5:10. Always that same quality of deliberate quiet. Always that same swift departure that left the corridor empty and the building to its ordinary pre-dawn breathing. By the end of the 2nd week of noticing, I had begun to wonder who it was. It is a strange thing, curiosity. It does not announce itself. It simply begins to occupy space in you until one day you realize it has been there for some time, making small renovations, rearranging your priorities without asking. By the time I acknowledged that I was genuinely curious about the person in 3B, I had already been curious for days without knowing it. I had never seen them. That was part of what made it interesting. This person who moved through the building before the light came, before the other tenants stirred, before the world outside began its daily accumulation of noise. I had seen the closed door of 3B plenty of times. A perfectly ordinary door with a small brass number and a doormat that said nothing, no words, just a neutral geometric pattern. But the person behind it remained hypothetical to me, assembled only from the evidence of their leaving, early, quiet, consistent. It was a Sunday when I finally met Virgil Berry, though met is perhaps too strong a word for what happened. Encountered, glimpsed, overlapped, briefly, like two circles in a Venn diagram sharing only the smallest sliver of space. I was coming up the stairs with groceries, 2 bags, slightly awkward, the kind of arrangement where you are managing just barely and would not want to add any additional complications. When the door to 3B opened at the exact moment I reached the 3rd floor landing. The man who came out was not what I had constructed in my imagination. I had built someone thin and angular, a person whose quietness was physical, whose body would reflect the carefulness of the sounds they made. Instead, Virgil Berry is broad across the shoulders, in a way that seems almost architectural, as if the body has its own structural opinion about how to move through space. He is not tall, perhaps an inch shorter than me, but there is a solidity to him that registers before anything else, a quality of being very definitely present in whatever space he occupies. His hair was dark and slightly overgrown, not unkempt, but certainly not tended, the kind of hair that has been left to its own devices and made reasonable decisions. His eyes, which I registered for only a fraction of a second before he looked away, were a color I could not immediately name, somewhere between gray and green, like certain river water. He was carrying a gym bag over one shoulder and a coffee thermos in one hand. He wore dark sweatpants and a worn Henley the color of old moss. He was clearly on his way out, in that focused way people have when they have a destination and a purpose and are not expecting to interact with anyone. He glanced at me. I glanced at him. Two tenants on a landing, neither of us prepared for the other. "Hey," he said. His voice was low, a little roughened, the way voices are when they have not yet fully woken up. "Hi," I managed, shifting my grocery bags to something slightly less precarious. He nodded once, a small, contained acknowledgement, and then moved past me toward the stairs, already descending before I had fully registered that the interaction was over. I stood on the landing for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. So, the person in 3B was him. His name, I learned from the small piece of tape on his mailbox in the lobby, which I examined with more attention than I had ever previously given to any mailbox in my life. Berry V. It read, in the slightly uneven capitals of someone who had typed their own label, neat, economical, like everything else I had observed about him. Virgil Berry. The name arrived in my mind and settled there with the uncanny comfort of a word that sounds right, like a key that was made for a specific lock. I told myself I was not thinking about him. I was remarkably good at this for approximately 48 hours, and then I stopped pretending. The building had a small common room on the ground floor, never much used. A few chairs, a table, a coffee maker that the building management had installed with vague, optimistic intentions about community. Most tenants used it only to retrieve packages or check their mail. I had used it twice, briefly, without ever encountering anyone else there. 3 weeks after first meeting Virgil on the landing, I came downstairs on a Saturday afternoon to find him at the table with a textbook open in front of him and a pen moving steadily across a notepad beside it. He had his coffee thermos beside him, perpetual companion, and he was frowning slightly at whatever he was reading. The frown of concentration rather than displeasure. That particular expression where the brow does the work of holding a thought in place. He looked up when I came in and, after a fraction of a second of what might have been recalibration, nodded the same way he had on the landing. "Hey," he said. "Same word, same contained delivery. Hi!" I gestured vaguely at the room. "Didn't mean to interrupt. You're not." He looked back at his textbook, but with the slightly altered posture of someone who is now aware of another presence rather than fully alone. I made myself a cup of coffee, not because I especially needed one, but because it gave me a reason to be there, and sat at the opposite end of the table. I had brought a book of my own, which I opened and looked at without reading for several minutes. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That was the thing I noticed first. The quality of the quiet between us was not the tense, effortful silence of two strangers trying to ignore each other. It was something more relaxed than that, more like the quiet of two people who have simply decided that words are not currently required. After perhaps 20 minutes, he turned a page and stretched his neck slightly to one side, that small involuntary movement of someone who has been still too long. "You're in 3C?" he said without looking up from the page. "Yeah, since October." I paused. "I've been hearing you leave in the mornings." He did look up then. His expression was not alarmed, more assessingly curious, as if adjusting some internal calculation. "Sorry about that." I tried to be quiet. "You are quiet," I said. "That's why I noticed. It's a very deliberate kind of quiet." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, more the shadow a smile makes before it arrives. "Training schedule," he said. "I have to be at the pool by 5:15. Swimming, then." That explained the gym bag. It explained the shoulders, too, though I did not say this. "Every day?" I asked. 6 days. Sundays. I go at 7. He looked back at his book. "Javier, right?" I think I saw your name on the mailbox. My name in his mouth was a small, ordinary thing, and also not ordinary at all. Right, Javier Fields, Virgil Berry. He said his own name with the slight self-consciousness of someone who has heard it found unusual before and has made peace with this. I know, I said. I looked at your mailbox. This time, the shadow of a smile arrived and became the actual thing. Brief, careful, but real. He had a good smile, the kind that engages the eyes rather than just the mouth. Mutual curiosity, he said, and returned to his textbook. We sat in the common room for another hour. Neither of us said much else. But when he packed up his things and stood, he paused at the door and said, "See you around, Javier Fields." And there was something in the way he said my full name, deliberate. Almost considering that I turned over in my mind for the rest of the afternoon. November arrived with the particular determination of a month that knows what it is for. The city shifted into its gray and gold phase. Leaves coming down in quantities that made every morning look like something was being slowly, beautifully dismantled. I was working from home those days. I do copywriting and content strategy, the kind of work that can happen anywhere with a laptop and enough quiet, and so my rhythms had become my own, unmoored from any institutional schedule. This meant that I was awake more often than I might otherwise have been at 4:45, 4:50, 5 in the morning, not always, not deliberately, but often enough that the sound of Virgil's leaving had become something I listened for without meaning to. The way you learn the pattern of a clock and begin to notice its absence more than its presence. I did not always hear him, but when I did, I found myself following the sound through the wall. The soft alarm, the moving around, the careful ritual of preparation, and feeling something I could not yet name. Something adjacent to comfort. The knowledge that the person beyond the wall was there, was moving, was going about the particular business of their particular life. It is strange, the intimacy of walls. We started talking more, Virgil and I, not dramatically, not all at once. In increments small enough that I did not notice the accumulation for a while. A few words in the corridor, a longer exchange when we both happened to be checking mail. A Sunday afternoon when he knocked on my door to ask if I had a spare phone charger and ended up staying for 40 minutes discussing a true crime documentary I had on in the background, which he had apparently also watched and had opinions about. He was not an easy person to know in the sense of a person who opens themselves readily, but he was not closed either. He was simply careful. Careful with his words, careful with what he revealed, careful in the way someone is when they have learned that not everything given freely is received with care. I recognized this carefulness because I possessed some version of it myself, though my version came from different history. What I noticed was that when he said a thing, he meant it. There was no performance in him, no layer of social lubrication that said things for the sake of saying them. If Virgil Berry told you the documentary was interesting, he found it interesting. If he said he did not know, he genuinely did not know. Rather than having an opinion, he was declining to share. This quality of meaning, what you say, exactly what you say, nothing more, nothing less, it was both challenging and deeply restful to be around. I found myself thinking about him more than was probably sensible. I noted this. Filed it where I file things I am not ready to examine, and continued. December came. The radiator in my apartment became more conversational. I bought a blanket the color of dark red wine and spent most evenings on my couch under it with varying levels of productivity. Virgil and I had progressed to the point of occasional dinner, not dating, not anything named. Just the organic proximity of two people who live beside each other and have found that they prefer each other's company to the alternative. He would appear at my door sometimes with takeout, or I would knock on his when I had made more soup than one person could reasonably address. These were not events we arranged in advance. They happen the way things happen when two people are circling each other without yet naming what the orbit is. His apartment was sparse but not bare. A distinction I made on the evening he finally let me in, the first time I had been inside 3B. The furniture was minimal and solid, the kind of things chosen for function and then quietly used for years. There were books on an actual shelf, a serious accumulation of them, mostly nonfiction. Biology, mathematics, a few histories, a surprising number of books about ocean life. There was a single plant on the windowsill, a succulent of some kind, thriving in its complete low-maintenance sufficiency. There were no decorative objects, no candles, no art on the walls. "You travel light," I said, looking around. "I moved a lot," he said, from the kitchen where he was doing something with rice. Got out of the habit of accumulating things. I wanted to ask why he had moved a lot. I held the question back, because there are questions that announce themselves as premature even to the person wanting to ask them. "The books are heavy," I said instead. A small pause from the kitchen. "Yeah," he said. "Those stayed." There is a version of a person that their books tell, and the version of Virgil his books told was of someone interested in the mechanics of the natural world, in how systems worked, in the logic underlying visible things. It matched what I already knew of him. This person who moved with precision, who chose words with deliberation, who swam in the dark because the schedule demanded it and had organized his life around what the schedule demanded. I liked him. I was trying very hard not to evaluate how much. The first time I woke up before him, it was an accident. December 22nd, which I know because it was the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, and I had been awake for a large portion of it for no reason I could explain except that my body had decided it no longer had a reliable relationship with sleep. I was lying in the dark at 4:37, watching the ceiling, when I thought, he will leave soon. And then, I could make coffee. I sat with this thought for a moment. It was a strange thought. It was the thought of someone doing something for another person at 4:37 in the morning when there was no expectation, no obligation, no particular reason. Just the awareness that in a few minutes the person next door would be preparing to walk out into a December morning at 5 degrees to go swim laps in a pool. And that a cup of coffee handed over in the corridor would cost me nothing and might matter to him. I got up. I made coffee. I stood in my kitchen in the dark, in my socks, and listened. At 4:52, I heard the familiar sequence. The soft alarm, the movement, the careful choreography of a person who has performed this ritual so many times, it has become as automatic as breath. I waited until I heard the door of 3B ease open, that particular whisper of a door managed with 2 hands, and then I opened my own door. He was in the corridor, gym bag over his shoulder, thermos in hand, already in motion. He stopped when he saw me. I was holding out a second cup of coffee. Just a cup! A plain white mug! Steam rising in the corridor air. He looked at the mug, then at me, then at the mug again. "You're awake," he said. "Couldn't sleep." I held the cup closer. "It's cold out. Seemed like the thing to do." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression, something I could not fully read, but that felt like a person being offered something small and unexpectedly moved by the smallness of it. "Thank you," he said, and reached out and took the mug. Our fingers overlapped briefly on the ceramic. His hands were warm, always warm. I would learn later. A swimmer's hands, I would think, permanently insulated against cold water by some internal thermodynamic commitment. At that moment, I registered the warmth of his fingers, and something happened in my chest that I had no name for and did not try to name. He raised the mug slightly in a kind of toast, then turned and went toward the stairs, descending into the dark of the building below. I stood in the corridor for a moment after he disappeared. The building was quiet. The corridor was empty. Outside the window at the end of the hall, I could see the black sky beginning its imperceptible transition toward something that would, in a few hours, become morning. I went back inside and did not sleep and did not particularly mind. The mug appeared back at my door that evening. Washed, dried, sitting on the mat with a small yellow sticky note on it. The note said, "Thank you, V." I kept the note. I am aware of how this reads and I am telling you anyway. There is a difference between falling for someone and recognizing that you have already fallen. The first is active, in progress, a thing happening now. The second is the moment of looking down and seeing that the ground is farther away than you realized, that the falling happened without announcement, that you are already somewhere you did not consciously choose to go. The second one happened to me on the 4th of January. Christmas and New Year had passed in the soft blur that holidays take when you are alone in a new place and choosing to treat that aloneness as a kind of rest rather than a deprivation. Virgil had gone to see family for 5 days, and I had been surprised by how much the building felt different without him in it. How the absence of those early morning sounds made the pre-dawn quiet a different quality of quiet. Less like company and more like just the absence of sound. He came back on the 2nd of January. I heard his keys in the corridor at 9 in the evening, heard the door of 3B open and close, heard the particular resumed activity of someone settling back into a space that is theirs. And I felt something unknot in me that I had not fully registered as knotted. 2 days later, January 4th. I knocked on his door in the early evening with leftover pasta and the admission to myself made quietly and without drama somewhere around the 2nd flight of stairs that I had missed him. He opened the door looking like someone who had been home a while, comfortable in gray sweatpants and a soft dark sweater, reading glasses I had never seen before, pushed up onto his forehead. The glasses were the thing that did it in the specific, unreasonable way that small details sometimes carry disproportionate weight. There was something about the reading glasses on his forehead that was so ordinary, so domestic, so completely without performance that it landed in me like a stone in still water. "Reading glasses," I said. He reached up and touched them, the brief self-consciousness of someone who forgot they were wearing them. "Yeah! I didn't know you wore them, just for reading." A pause. "Are you going to come in, or are you going to stand there cataloging my accessories?" I came in. We ate the pasta at his kitchen table. He told me about his family. Briefly, carefully, in the way he told everything. A sister who lived 3 hours north, parents who had retired to the coast, a general landscape of people who were present, but not particularly close. I told him about my own family, in similar terms, the factual summary of people who matter in ways that are real, but not always comfortable to articulate. We talked for 3 hours. At some point, the topic shifted. I cannot remember the exact mechanism of how it happened, and we were discussing what we had wanted when we were young. Those early versions of a future that seemed so clear and then become something more complicated. He told me he had wanted to be a marine biologist, spent the first 2 years of college working toward it. Then the money ran out and the pragmatic rerouting happened, and now he was finishing an accelerated nursing program which he liked more than he had expected to, which had turned out to be its own form of caring about how bodies work. "Do you miss it?" I asked. "The marine biology direction." He thought about this with the seriousness he gave all questions worth answering. Sometimes, not the career so much as the specific feeling of being that certain, of knowing what you wanted to know. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. "I'm not sure I feel that certain about most things anymore." There was something in his voice when he said this, a weight that was honest and unguarded, briefly, in a way he did not often allow. I thought about how to respond and then said, "I think uncertainty is what happens when you know enough to know what you don't know." He looked at me for a moment. "That's either very wise or very convenient." "Could be both." He almost smiled. "Yeah," he said, "could be. Saw!" I walked back to my apartment at midnight and stood in my dark kitchen and acknowledged, for the first time without flinching from it, that I was in significant difficulty where Virgil Berry was concerned. January progressed with its characteristic commitment to gray skies and the kind of cold that has designs on your specific bones. I continued to occasionally make coffee before 5 in the morning when I was awake anyway. He continued to pick it up without much ceremony and to return the mug always clean, sometimes with a note, sometimes without, and the notes, when they appeared, were always brief, 2 or 3 words, sometimes just an initialism. But I began to understand that the notes were their own kind of language, a form of acknowledgement from someone for whom acknowledgement did not come easily. I started learning his schedule by osmosis. 6 days of 5 in the morning pool sessions. Wednesdays and Saturdays. He was usually home by 3 in the afternoon, which was when his clinical placement ended. The other days varied. He studied in the evenings, at his kitchen table, or occasionally in the common room, textbooks spread out around him with the organized chaos of active learning. He ate well, but without fuss, the meals of someone who understands nutrition as an input into performance rather than as a pleasure. He did not watch much television. He read constantly. I, in turn, continued my work at my own table, while listening to the rhythm of his presence on the other side of the wall, finding in it a kind of company that I had not sought and was not sure what to do with. The thing about Virgil was not just that I was attracted to him. That was there. Yes, the physical awareness that arrived whenever he was in a room and declined to leave, but it was more than that, and the more than that was what made it complicated. I liked how his mind worked. I liked the way he said things. I liked his patience with difficult questions, the way he would sit with a problem rather than rushing toward the comfortable resolution. I liked that when he laughed. Genuinely, not the polite social laugh, but the real one. It happened before he could decide to be more contained, a sudden brief brightness that surprised even him sometimes. I was, in other words, experiencing the full inconvenient range of what it means to care about someone. Not just the wanting, but the actual liking, the recognition, the sense that this person made the world more interesting by being in it. What I did not know, could not yet assess, was whether any of this moved in both directions. He was warm toward me in his particular way, consistent, present, without the performance of warmth that some people deploy as a social lubricant. He chose to spend time with me. He told me things, incrementally, that felt like small acts of trust. But he was a private person, and the interpretive difficulty with a private person is that you cannot always tell the difference between private regard and private regard of a particular kind. I sat with this uncertainty and tried to be patient with it, which is something I am not naturally good at. The 20th of January was a Saturday, and I had been invited to a small gathering at a colleague's apartment. The kind of mild social event I could take or leave. And I mentioned it to Virgil in passing something about having to change into something presentable in that throwaway way you mention things that don't require a response. You could invite me, he said. I looked at him. He was reading. We were in the common room, our default Saturday afternoon location by now. And he did not look up, but the stillness of his posture had a slightly different quality than usual. The stillness of someone who has just said a thing and is waiting to see what happens to it. You want to come? I said. You can say no. I'm not saying no. I'm saying I didn't think you'd want to. He looked up then, over the rim of the book. Why not? You don't seem like someone who enjoys parties. It's not a party. You said it was a small gathering. A pause. I can behave at small gatherings. Something in my chest did a slow, unhelpful turn. Then yes, come. He came. He wore a dark button-down and jeans and looked, with his particular quality of solid, unhurried presence, like someone who always looks exactly like themselves, in any context. My colleague Elena, who noticed things, caught my eye at one point during the evening and raised her eyebrows at me with the exaggerated significance of someone who has reached a conclusion. I shook my head slightly. She shrugged and refilled her wine glass with the look of someone who has already moved on to the next conclusion. On the way home in the cold walking, the 7 blocks, because neither of us had suggested a cab and the cold was sharp but not unmanageable, Virgil was quiet for a while in the easy way of walking. Quiet, the silence of movement rather than of withholding. And then, approximately 2 blocks from home, he said, "Your friends are good. They're colleagues mostly, but yeah." That woman Elena kept looking at me like she was trying to figure out what I was. What do you mean? A beat, like she was deciding what category I went in. I thought about Elena's raised eyebrows. Did it bother you? No, simple, clean. Then, what category did she decide on? I considered my options, said, she didn't tell me. He made a small sound that might have been amusement, and we walked the last block without speaking, and the silence had a different texture to it than it had 2 blocks back. Warmer, somehow, despite the cold. As if something had been carefully added to it. We said goodnight in the corridor of the 3rd floor. He went into his apartment. I went into mine. I stood in my hallway for a moment with my coat still on and acknowledged that I was getting very tired of not knowing. February arrived and changed things. Not all at once. Not with dramatic announcement. But February has a particular quality in cities. The long gray exhaustion of it. The cold that has stopped being novel and is simply relentless. The particular cabin pressure closeness of days spent too much inside. And it creates conditions for things that might otherwise wait. The first shift happened on a Tuesday evening when I knocked on his door because I was worried about him. This is worth explaining. At 7 in the morning on that Tuesday, I had heard his alarm go off through the wall, and then nothing. The alarm sounded, was not silenced, and continued until it cycled through whatever its automatic shutoff was. Virgil had never not silenced his alarm within the first 30 seconds of its sounding. Not once, in 4 months of living beside him, had I heard the alarm last more than 30 seconds. I got up and stood by my wall with the specific listening posture of someone doing their best not to be absurd. Nothing. No movement, no footsteps, no careful door, just the building's ordinary sounds. He did not leave at 5 that morning. I told myself there could be any number of explanations, which was true. I told myself it was not my business, which was also true. I went to my desk and worked and checked my phone approximately 15 times for no reason. And at 7 in the evening, I picked up the small container of soup I had made 3 days ago and still not finished and walked to his door and knocked. Lie. It took longer than usual for him to answer. When he did, he was clearly not well. Not dramatically unwell, not emergency room unwell, but the particular diminished state of someone running a fever, slightly unfocused, a sheen of sweat on his forehead, wearing a thick hoodie despite the apartment being warm. He blinked at me in the doorway with the mild confusion of someone whose brain is working at reduced capacity. "Hi," he said. His voice had gone lower and rougher than usual. "You didn't go to the pool," I said. A moment where he seemed to locate this fact somewhere in his current diminished processing. "No. Are you okay?" "I'm fine." The automatic response of a person who reflexively minimizes. "Virgil!" I said his name with just enough weight to communicate that I was not going to accept fine as a complete answer. He looked at me, then at the soup container, then back at me. "I have a fever," he said, as if this were a personal failing. "Can I come in?" He stepped back, which I interpreted as yes. His apartment was warm and dim, the light low, the couch occupied by the evidence of a day spent there. A blanket pulled over the cushions, a book face down on the armrest. A half-drunk glass of water on the coffee table. He settled back onto the couch and I went to his kitchen and found a bowl and heated the soup and brought it to him. He looked at the bowl and then up at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. It was not precisely vulnerability, but it was adjacent to it. The look of someone who is not accustomed to being taken care of and does not quite know what to do with the experience of it. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know." I sat in the armchair across from him. "Eat the soup." He ate the soup. We watched something low stakes on his television for a couple of hours. I do not even remember what. And he fell asleep before it was finished. The soup bowl empty on the coffee table. His head tipped slightly against the back of the couch. I watched him for a moment longer than was probably warranted. The slow, deep breathing of sleep, the way his face softened from its usual, careful arrangement. Some tension around the jaw and forehead, relaxing when consciousness withdrew its requirement of composure. I got up quietly and found a heavier blanket in the linen closet, second shelf, folded in thirds, dark blue, and draped it over him without waking him. I washed the bowl. I turned the television off. I left his apartment, pulling the door to, with both hands the way he always did, making as little sound as possible. Back in my own apartment, I sat on my couch in the dark and felt the specific weight of caring about someone pressing on my sternum. The next morning, I woke at 4:50 because I was still keeping his hours even on days he did not, apparently. There was no sound from 3B. He was sleeping, presumably the deep sleep of a body burning through a fever. I made 2 cups of coffee anyway and left one outside his door, the same yellow sticky notes from the drawer in my kitchen. Mine said, "Rest, the pool will still be there." I found a note on my mat that evening. "Feeling better. Thank you for yesterday. I know I'm bad at being taken care of. Working on it. V." I read the note 4 times. I put it with the other one. He came to thank me in person the following Friday when he was visibly recovered, his usual solid self, slightly replenished with the specific energy of someone returning to full operational status. He knocked at my door at 7 in the evening with 2 coffees from the place 3 blocks away, the good one, which required some intentional effort to get to. "Peace offering," he said, holding one out, "for being difficult when I was sick." "You weren't difficult, you were just sick." "I was difficult," he said. "I don't take help well." I accepted the coffee. "Neither do I, for the record." "I know." He said it simply. "The way you say something you have observed and filed. I've noticed." "What have you noticed?" I asked, more curious than guarded. He tilted his head slightly. We were standing in my doorway, the open apartment behind me, the corridor light above us. "That you manage things yourself if you can. That you don't ask for things you think you might not get." A pause. "That you make coffee for other people before 5 in the morning and then go back to pretending you weren't up." "I wasn't pretending," I said. "I genuinely was awake." "Every morning?" "A beat. Most mornings." He held my gaze in that steady, unhurried way of his, the way he looked at things he was genuinely trying to understand. And then he said, "I started waking up earlier because of you!" The words landed in the specific quiet of the corridor with no drama and considerable weight. "What do you mean?" I said, knowing what he meant. "I set the alarm for 4:30 instead of 4:45, starting in December." He was still holding his coffee. "Because I didn't want to miss you." There are moments that you live in twice, once in real time and once in the after, when you turn them over in the better light of knowing what they meant. This was one of those moments, and I knew it even as it was happening, even as I was still processing the sentence and what it contained. "Virgil," I said, "you don't have to say anything back right now." Measured, careful, giving me room. "I just wanted you to know. I'm awake before 5 in the morning because I'm listening for you," I said. "I have been for months. I make the coffee because I want to do something for you before you have to go out into the cold. I look for your notes and I keep them. I missed you when you went home for Christmas, and I didn't admit that to myself for 2 days after you got back." I took a breath. "I'm trying to say something back right now." He looked at me. Something in his expression had shifted, had softened, had become the expression of someone who has received something they had not allowed themselves to entirely hope for. "Okay," he said, the single word doing a great deal of work. "Okay," I said back. We stood in the doorway for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who have just crossed a threshold and are still orienting to the new location. "Come in," I said. "Bring your coffee." He came in. The first time he kissed me, it was almost 11 at night, and we had been talking for hours. On my couch, coffee replaced at some point by tea, the city outside gone quiet with its particular late-night quality. We had talked about everything and nothing in the specifically luxurious way that becomes possible between 2 people once the pretending of not quite knowing has been dispensed with, and there was a different warmth to the room. A different quality of ease, as if some atmospheric pressure had been released. He had been on the other end of the couch initially, the polite social distance of people who have not yet entirely renegotiated the geography. Over the course of the evening, this had shifted incrementally in the way these things do when no one is managing it consciously. By 11 o'clock, we were at the center of the couch, a small gap of space between us, close enough that I was very aware of the warmth of him beside me. He had said something. I don't remember what something dry and accurate about a person we had both been discussing, and I had laughed genuinely. And when I looked back, he was already looking at me with an expression that had nothing navigational or careful in it, just clear and present and close. "Hi," I said, which was not the wittiest thing I have ever said. "Hi," he said back, which was equally economical, and then he reached up and touched my jaw with one hand. Warm, warm, those permanently warm hands, and kissed me. It was not a tentative kiss. He was not a tentative person, and when he had decided something, he committed to it. It was careful, but not hesitant, unhurried, in the way that meant he was paying attention rather than rushing. I felt his hand move from my jaw to the back of my neck, and I put my hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat faster than his usual composure would suggest. Fast enough to be honest about what this meant to him. When he pulled back, barely, I could feel his breath against my mouth. "I've been wanting to do that for a while," he said. "You're very good at appearing to not want things," I said. "I know." A pause, his thumb moving slowly at the back of my neck. "I'm working on that too." I kissed him again. He kissed me back. The tea went cold on the coffee table. Horror! There is a specific joy in the early stage of something becoming real, when the thing you have been careful not to want too much becomes the thing you are allowed to want openly. Everything takes on a slightly different quality. The ordinary texture of days becomes more vivid, not because things have changed, but because your permission to experience them has expanded. The mornings changed, not immediately, not with declarations or renegotiated schedules, but in the way things change between two people who have decided something without needing to announce it constantly. Gradually, naturally, the new arrangement finding its own shape. He still left at 5 in the morning because the training schedule was the training schedule and had not changed. But now when he left, sometimes I was awake and sometimes I had his coffee ready and he would stop in my doorway before descending the stairs, not for long, because time existed and the pull was not going to hold itself, but long enough for a hand on my face, long enough for a word or two said in the rough quiet of 5 in the morning voices. I started finding my rhythm shifted around his, not uncomfortably, not in the way of losing yourself in someone else's orbit, but in the way of two gravitational forces making their natural adjustment. I stayed up later with him some nights and woke earlier on the days we had decided to have coffee together before he left. I understood for the first time with any clarity what it meant to organize even small things around another person by choice rather than by requirement. He would come back from swimming, sometimes 7 in the morning, sometimes 8, depending on the length of the session and whether he had stayed to do drills, and occasionally he would knock on my door instead of going directly to his. Still wet-haired, still carrying the pool's particular smell of chlorine and cold air and exertion, he would come in and sit at my kitchen table with the specific, relaxed quality of a body that has been worked and is now settling, and I would make eggs or toast or whatever was manageable. And he would talk more easily in those post-swim mornings than at other times, some of his usual careful withholding dissolved by the physical expenditure thoughts arriving more loosely. I loved those mornings. I am not embarrassed to say so. March arrived with the tentative suggestion of spring. Not committed to it yet, still pulling on gray some mornings, but occasionally giving way to something that had the quality of actual light rather than the diluted gray of February. I was sleeping better. I was working better. I was, by most available measures, better than I had been in some time, and I was not naive enough to think this was unrelated to Virgil. The thing about Virgil was that he made space. Not loudly, not through the kind of demonstrative making space that draws attention to itself, but he was consistently, quietly present in a way that did not demand anything back. He did not require performance from me. He did not need me to be particularly cheerful, or on, or articulate, or interesting. He seemed genuinely content to exist alongside me in whatever state I arrived in, and this, particularly, was something I had not understood until then, how much I had been doing without. My previous relationship, which I had been in when I left the apartment I moved here from, and which is not the story I am telling, but which bears some brief acknowledgement, had been with someone who required a great deal of managing. Not in a malicious way. People who require managing are not always malicious, are often simply anxious, simply people whose own needs press so urgently that they crowd the space. But it had left me with the habit of preemptively shrinking, of calibrating my own state against what someone else could handle, of making myself quieter or smaller or less in order to not be too much. Virgil did not do this to me. Virgil, when I was quiet, was simply also quiet. When I was not okay, he asked once directly and then waited for the answer I gave rather than pushing for a different one. When I was good, he was good alongside me, not performatively, but genuinely, the way someone is glad for you when things are right for you. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. The conversation about my previous relationship happened on a Sunday in March, on his couch, which had become a comfortable location for the longer conversations. I had told him things in bits and pieces over the preceding weeks, the way information comes out when two people are building toward each other. And that Sunday, I found myself telling him more directly, more fully about the shape of what I had left. He listened in the particular way he listened to important things, which was without interrupting and without immediately preparing a response, allowing the thing being said to land fully before responding to it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Did you know you were shrinking?" he asked. "When you were in it. I thought about this. Sometimes. Not consistently. It's easier to see from outside." "Yeah." He was looking at the window, the early afternoon light coming in at an angle. "I think I've done versions of that too. Different context. Same mechanism." This was more about his past than he usually offered. I waited. "There was someone," he said, still looking at the window, "a few years ago, who needed a version of me I couldn't maintain. And I tried for longer than I should have, and by the time it ended, I wasn't sure which parts of me were the original ones and which ones had been arranged for someone else's benefit." A pause, the weight of a thing being admitted that does not get admitted often. "That's why I moved a lot," he said. "For a while, not running exactly, just resetting." "And now?" I asked. He looked at me then. "I think I stopped resetting." I wanted to say something adequate to this and could not find anything that qualified, so I reached over and put my hand over his where it rested on the couch between us. He looked at our hands and then turned his over so that we were palm to palm, his fingers closing around mine with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. We sat like that for a while. The light moved across the floor in its patient way. Spring arrived in full around the middle of March and brought with it a different quality to the mornings. The darkness that had been absolute at 5 a.m. started to yield earlier, not light yet, but a different darkness, more blue than black, with the suggestion of something gathering at the horizon. I started noticing this on the days I was up when he left, the sky through the corridor window beginning its long project of becoming morning while the building was still technically nocturnal. One morning, a Friday, the 28th of March, I was up before him, not by much, but enough. I made the coffee, set his cup by the door the way I always did, and then instead of going back inside, I stood in the corridor by the window and watched the sky. When his door opened at 4:54, he stopped when he saw me standing there rather than at my own door. "What are you doing?" he said. "Watching it get light." He came to stand beside me. We both looked out at the sky, which was doing something extraordinary and slow. The very deepest blue beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, imperceptibly slow. The way change happens when you are watching for it, and it is happening anyway, regardless of observation. "I don't usually see this part," he said. "I'm in the pool by now." "I know." I handed him his coffee without looking at him. "I wanted to show you." He was quiet, both hands around the mug, looking out at the sky that was very slowly deciding what color it wanted to be. After a few minutes, he said, "This is the part of mornings you actually like, isn't it? Not the mornings themselves, this part." I thought about it. "The transition," I said, "when it's still mostly dark but you know it's coming." "I like the structure," he said. "The schedule, the predictability." "I know. That's why I wanted to show you the other thing." He looked at me sideways. There was something in his expression that was layered, something thoughtful and something soft and something that I had learned to recognize as his particular version of being moved by something. "You make me see different things," he said, "than I would see on my own." "So do you," I said. He put his arm around me then, warm and solid, and I leaned into him slightly, and we watched the sky continue its long, slow work of becoming morning. He was late to the pool by 12 minutes that day. He told me this later. He did not seem to think it was a problem. The harder conversation came in April. We had been us, this thing that was us, for about 2 months in any meaningful sense. Though the counting is imprecise because the thing between us had been developing far longer than either of us had named it. And 2 months is long enough to have learned someone's ordinary habits and comforts and to have started to see where the more complicated things live. Virgil's complicated things lived, as far as I could understand them, primarily around the question of his own sufficiency. He had extremely high standards for himself. the training schedule, the nursing program, the personal code of self-reliance that ran underneath everything. And when he fell short of them in any way, even small ways, even ways that any reasonable external observer would classify as simply being human, he took it harder than he showed. I started noticing this in small moments. The way his jaw set when he made a mistake at placement. The particular closed quality of his expression on evenings when the studying had not gone the way he needed it to. The way he said, "I'm fine," in a specific register that was different from his neutral fine, a register I came to recognize as the sound of him managing something alone that did not entirely need to be managed alone. I raised this on a Thursday evening in April, sitting at his kitchen table after dinner. I did not raise it dramatically. I said, "You don't always have to be okay." He looked up from the textbook he had been pretending to read. "What? Around me? You don't always have to have it managed." I met his eyes. "I've seen you sick. I've heard you through the wall on the nights when you couldn't sleep. I noticed the Thursday faces when placement has been bad. You don't have to perform fine for me." There was a long pause. He looked at the textbook, then back at me. "It's not performance," he said. "I actually am." He stopped, started again. "I'm used to handling things." "I know." I kept my voice level, without pressure. "I'm not asking you to stop handling them. I'm saying that handling them doesn't have to mean handling them alone." A longer pause. Outside, April wind pressed against the window. "It's not," he started, and then stopped again in the way he did when he was trying to find the honest thing rather than the comfortable one. "I don't want to be a weight on you," he said finally. Another pause. "My need for everything to be in order. I know it's a lot sometimes. I don't want that to be something you have to manage around." Oh. Something clicked into place in my understanding of him. Something about the careful self-containment, the performance of sufficiency, the way he gave but found receiving complicated. He was not holding back because he did not trust me. He was holding back because he was trying to spare me. "Virgil," I said, "do you think that's what I'm doing, managing around you?" "Sometimes," he said quietly. "Honest. Uncomfortable with the honesty, but doing it anyway." "When has my having to do that ever been true?" I asked. "Specifically, when have you been a weight?" He was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table, the thinking posture. "The sick thing," he said. "When you had to come look after me." "I wanted to. I went looking for an excuse to check on you. The soup was a prop." I leaned forward slightly. "What else?" He couldn't find something else. I could see this in his face, the search for examples that would hold up, and the slow recognition that they did not. "I want to know when things are hard for you," I said. "Not because I want to fix them, not because I need to manage anything. Because you matter to me, and the things that matter to you matter to me, and that's just what that means." He looked at me for a long moment. Something in his expression had shifted, some layer of careful maintenance giving way to something more open, more vulnerable, more him. "I don't know how to do that easily," he said. "I know. You don't have to do it easily. You just have to do it." I paused. "I'll tell you when I don't know how to do things. We can figure them out at the same pace." Another long pause. And then he put his hand on the table between us, palm up, an offering so small and so deliberate that it landed with more weight than most large gestures I have received. I put my hand in his. "Okay," he said. The same word again, the same economy. But the word had kept accumulating meaning over the months, and by now it carried a great deal. April 23rd, I went to see him swim. He had mentioned the Saturday morning time trial. Once, briefly, in passing, without any implication that it was an invitation. But I had heard the particular quality under the casual mention, the kind of thing a person says while technically not asking, and I had decided. I showed up at the facility at 6:45 in the morning with a terrible coffee from the nearest gas station because nothing else was open at that hour. The pool was a university training facility, lanes marked and precise, the smell of chlorine sharp and clean in the early morning air. There were a few other people in the bleacher area, coaches, other swimmers people, the quiet Saturday morning population of those who have agreed to exist at this hour. I found a spot in the bleachers and waited. He came out of the changing rooms with 3 other swimmers. already in the focus mode of someone who has arrived at the thing the day has been organized around. He was wearing a racing suit and a cap and goggles pushed up on his forehead, and he was talking to one of the other swimmers about something logistical, his attention already on the water. He had not seen me yet, and then he did. He stopped, just briefly, a full second pause in his forward movement, and something moved across his face, surprise, and then something quieter and deeper, a recognition. He held my gaze for a moment, and I raised the terrible gas station copy toward him in a small salute. He almost smiled. Then the coach said something, and he pulled down his goggles and stepped to the block and dove in. I watched him swim. I cannot explain fully what it was like to watch him. He was different in the water. Not more himself exactly, but differently himself. Some quality that his ordinary stillness suggested fully realized in movement. He was fast. Not impressively fast, in the way of watching someone push through something. Fast, in the way of watching someone doing the thing they are built for. The effort translated entirely into efficiency. His body moved through water the way a well-made thing moves through the medium it was made for. I sat in the bleachers with my terrible coffee and watched him for 45 minutes and felt the specific, slow overflow of caring about someone doing the thing they love. After the time trial, after the debriefing with the coach and the changing and the gradual dissolution of the morning's focused atmosphere, he found me still in the bleachers. His hair was wet. He was carrying his bag. He looked like he had worked hard and it had been worth it. He came up to where I was sitting and stood there for a moment, looking at me with the expression I had been learning to read. The one that meant he was feeling something more than he was going to immediately say. "You didn't tell me you were coming," he said. "You didn't uninvite me. You should have seen last month." I had a better time. "I didn't come to see your time," I said. "I came to see you." He sat down beside me in the bleachers, close, shoulder to shoulder. Outside, the city was waking up to its Saturday, traffic beginning to build somewhere distantly beyond the facility walls. "Thank you," he said, "for being here. I wanted to be." A pause. And then he said, quietly, to the air in front of us rather than to me directly, "No one has come before to something like this. I absorbed this." Did not make it a bigger moment than he wanted it to be. Just said, "I'll come again." He exhaled, very slightly. "Yeah," he said, "okay." We sat in the bleachers of the empty pool for a little longer than was strictly necessary before getting up to go home. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.